I always thought my life would begin later. Not in a dramatic way, not with fireworks or some sudden transformation. Just, later. After I figured things out. After I felt ready. After I stopped feeling uncertain. Later became my favorite word. I used it to calm myself when something felt unfinished. I used it to excuse inaction. I used it as proof that I hadn't given up, just postponed. I didn't realize that postponement could quietly turn into a permanent state. From the outside, my life looked normal. That's the word people used. Normal. Stable. Sensible. I met expectations. I followed routines. I did what made sense given who I was and where I came from. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't lost. I wasn't failing. I was waiting. Waiting to feel confident enough. Waiting to feel certain enough. Waiting for a version of myself who wouldn't hesitate. That version never arrived. I told myself I was being patient. Responsible. That not everyone needed to rush into life. That timing mattered. What I didn't understand was that time doesn't reward hesitation. It simply moves on. I remember a specific morning that keeps returning to me. I was standing on a train platform, early, the sky still dark, the air cold and empty. Trains arrived. Doors opened. People stepped in with purpose. I stayed where I was. Not because I missed my train, but because I didn't know which one I was supposed to take. That moment felt symbolic even then. I watched the train leave, the sound fading into the distance, and told myself I'd catch the next one. There would always be another. That's how I lived. Opportunities came and went. Not dramatically, politely. Invitations, chances, ideas that ask something of me. Courage. Commitment. Risk. I smiled. I nodded. I said, maybe later. Later became a storage room for everything I was afraid to try. I didn't lack dreams. I lacked permission from myself. Every time I felt the pull to act, a quieter voice responded with logic. Not yet. You're not ready. You need more time. That voice sounded reasonable. It also sounded convincing enough to silence the other one. The one that whispered, if not now, when years passed like that. Quietly. Without landmarks. Days blended into each other, marked only by routines and obligations. I became very good at maintaining momentum without direction. People assumed I knew where I was going. I let them. It was easier than admitting I didn't. I wasn't unhappy. That's what still haunts me. Unhappiness would have forced change. Pain would have demanded attention. But what I felt was neutrality, a smooth, numbing middle ground where nothing was urgent enough to act on. My life was comfortable enough to endure. Endurance became my metric. I measured success by how little disruption I caused. How few mistakes I made. How well I avoided regret. Ironically, that avoidance built its own. I started noticing how often I said no to things that excited me, not because they were wrong, but because they were uncertain. How often I chose what was familiar over what was alive. I convinced myself that certainty was safety. But certainty without movement is stagnation. I began to feel like a bystander in my own days. Events happened. Decisions were made. Time passed. I was present but not engaged. At night, lying awake, I sometimes imagined an alternate version of my life. Not a fantasy, just a version where I had said yes a little sooner. Where I had tried before feeling ready. Where I had accepted that readiness is built through action, not waiting. Those thoughts didn't inspire me. They exhausted me. Because they reminded me of how much time I had spent preparing for a life that hadn't started. I kept telling myself there would be a moment when things clicked. When clarity arrived. When fear dissolved enough to allow movement. That moment never came. Instead, something else arrived. A quiet realization that made my chest tighten. What if this is it? What if there is no beginning I'm waiting for? What if life doesn't announce itself? What if the only thing separating me from living is the decision to stop waiting? That thought didn't bring relief. It brought panic. Because it meant there was nothing left to blame. No timing. No circumstances. No missing information. Just me. Standing still. I started to understand that waiting had become my identity. It protected me from mistakes, yes, but it also protected me from experience. I hadn't ruined my life. I had delayed it so long that it no longer recognized me. The scariest part wasn't the time I had already lost. It was the realization that I was still losing it quietly, patiently, one unchosen day at a time. And for the first time, I wondered whether the life I was waiting for had already passed me by, not because I was unlucky, but because I never stepped forward when it was still approaching. That thought stayed with me. It didn't scream. It didn't demand. It simply refused to leave. After that thought appeared, I tried to bury it. I told myself I was being dramatic. That everyone feels behind sometimes. That life isn't a race, and there's no schedule I'm supposed to follow. Those ideas sounded healthy. They were also convenient. Because they allowed me to keep waiting without admitting that waiting had become my default state. I went back to my routines with renewed discipline. I told myself consistency was a virtue. That showing up mattered more than direction. That movement, any movement, was better than uncertainty. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't moving forward. I was circling. Every day felt like a variation of the one before it. Same actions. Same thoughts. Same internal negotiations. I started noticing how often I delayed decisions that required commitment. Not because I didn't care, but because caring would force me to act. Acting meant choosing. Choosing meant losing alternatives. And I had built my entire life around keeping options alive. Options felt like freedom. In reality, they were a leash. As long as nothing was chosen, nothing could fail. Nothing could disappoint. Nothing could prove me wrong. I realized how deeply I feared being wrong. Not mistaken wrong. Wrong about what I wanted. Wrong about who I thought I was. Wrong about the life I believed I was meant to live. Waiting protected me from that possibility. But it also protected me from discovering anything real. I began to feel restless in ways I couldn't explain. Not anxious, unsettled. Like my body knew something my mind refused to accept. I felt it in small moments. Standing in line. Sitting through conversations. Looking at my calendar filled with obligations that led nowhere. Everything felt provisional. As if my life were a draft that I kept editing instead of publishing. People around me talked about decisions they had made, imperfect ones, risky ones. Some were happy. Some weren't. But they knew. They had stories. I had explanations. There's a difference. Stories come from action. Explanations come from avoidance. I started feeling envy, not of outcomes, but of commitment. Of people who had chosen something, anything, and lived inside that choice long enough to feel its weight. I told myself I was different. More cautious. More thoughtful. But that was another lie I used to stay still. One evening, I tried to list the things I was actively choosing in my life. Not the things I was maintaining, the things I was choosing. The list was embarrassingly short. Most of my life was being carried forward by inertia. Decisions made years ago that I kept honoring because changing them felt like admitting they were wrong. I wasn't honoring my past self. I was trapped by him. That realization hurt more than I expected. Because it meant I had confused loyalty with fear. I stayed loyal to old choices even when they no longer fit. Loyal to old versions of myself even when they had outgrown me. I told myself that changing direction would make everything I'd done before meaningless. But staying was making me meaningless. I noticed how numb I had become to time. Weeks disappeared without leaving an impression. Months passed without memory markers. I wasn't bored. I was absent. And absence, I learned, is the most dangerous state of all because it feels survivable. I started to understand why no alarm ever went off. Why nothing external forced me to change. My life wasn't broken. It was unfinished. And unfinished things can last forever if you let them. That's when fear shifted. I stopped fearing mistakes. I started fearing permanence. The idea that this waiting, this suspended half-life could quietly become the rest of my existence terrified me. Not because it was painful. Because it was empty. I imagined myself years from now, still saying not yet, still preparing, still waiting for a moment that never arrived. That image felt unbearable. For the first time, I understood that waiting was no longer neutral. It was a decision. A decision to let time decide for me. And time, I was learning, is not gentle with indecision. It doesn't punish you. It simply moves on. I didn't know yet how to step forward. I didn't have clarity, confidence, or courage. But something inside me had changed. Waiting no longer felt safe. It felt like surrender. And once you see waiting for what it is, you can't pretend it's patience anymore. The moment I stopped waiting didn't feel heroic. There was no surge of confidence, no sudden clarity, no inner voice announcing that it was finally time. What I felt instead was fear, clean, honest fear, and something beneath it that surprised me. Relief. Not relief that everything would be okay. Relief that I was no longer pretending that everything already was. I realized that for years I had been waiting for courage to appear before I moved. I thought courage was a prerequisite, something you earn through preparation, reflection, and patience. I had it backwards. Courage doesn't arrive first. It forms after you act. Waiting had protected me from embarrassment, from visible mistakes, from choosing the wrong life. But it had also protected me from choosing any life at all. I didn't start by making a big decision. I started by stopping a small lie. I stopped telling myself that I was still preparing. Preparation has a direction. Waiting does not. I admitted that I didn't need more time. I needed movement. That admission felt dangerous, because it meant there was nothing left to hide behind. No future version of myself to defer responsibility to. No imaginary moment when everything would align perfectly. There was just now. And now was uncomfortable. I took a step without knowing where it would lead. Not a dramatic leap, just a step that closed one door instead of keeping them all open. Closing that door hurt more than I expected. It felt like loss. Because it was. Every choice destroys possibilities. That's the cost no one wants to talk about. The moment you choose, you bury the lives you didn't live. I had spent years preserving those lives in theory. Now, I had to let them die. That grief was real. I grieved the person I could have been if I had chosen differently sooner. I grieved the time I spent rehearsing instead of living. I grieved the safety of indefinite possibility. But beneath that grief, something new appeared. Weight. Not heaviness, weight. My days started to feel solid again. Decisions mattered. Consequences existed. Time stopped slipping through me unnoticed. Even difficult moments felt sharper, more defined. I wasn't happier. I was present. Presence is not comforting. It demands that you feel doubt without escaping into fantasy. That you make mistakes without rewriting the past to justify them. That you live with the knowledge that some things will never be recovered. But presence also does something extraordinary. It gives your life texture. For the first time in years, my days left impressions. I remembered conversations. I felt the passing of hours. I noticed when something mattered to me, not because it was safe, but because it stirred something inside me. I stopped asking myself whether I was doing the right thing. I asked whether I was doing anything at all. That question became my compass. I learned that fear doesn't disappear when you stop waiting. It changes shape. It stops being a barrier and becomes a companion, something you carry instead of something that stops you. Some days, regret still visits me. Regret for the time I lost. Regret for the moments I avoided. Regret for how long I mistook patience for wisdom. I don't fight that regret anymore. I listen to it. Because regret is the sound of awareness arriving late but arriving nonetheless. The most important thing I learned is this: there is no moment when life officially starts. There is no signal. No permission slip. No guarantee. Life begins the moment you stop waiting for certainty and accept responsibility for movement. Waiting felt safe because it delayed failure. But it also delayed truth. Truth requires commitment. Commitment requires loss. Loss requires grief. And grief, unlike waiting, means you were alive enough to care. If you're listening to this and you feel that familiar suspension, that sense that your life hasn't quite begun yet, I want you to understand something clearly: you are not behind. But you are not early either. You are exactly where your choices have placed you. And the moment you choose differently, time reorganizes itself around that choice. You don't need confidence to begin. You don't need clarity to move. You don't need to know where you'll end up. You only need to stop calling delay a strategy. I didn't ruin my life by waiting. I almost lost it. Not to tragedy. Not to failure. But to postponement. Now, my life is smaller in some ways. Fewer options. Fewer imagined futures. But it is heavier, and that weight tells me I'm finally holding something real. I don't know where this path leads. I only know that I am no longer standing on the platform watching trains leave. I am on one. It may not be the perfect one. It may not be the one I imagined years ago. But it is moving. And after a lifetime of waiting for my life to start, movement uncertain, imperfect, irreversible, is finally enough.